everyone, this is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Hi Patty, how are you today?
I am fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, and as like our tradition lately, we've been picking up little dribs and drabs of subscribers here and there. So if you are watching this on any of our video platforms and there's a subscribe button and you're not already subscribed, please consider clicking that subscribe button down below. Um, I've also switched out things instead of having a whole bunch of links. I resurrected our link tree, so I have a single link to the link tree, and then everything else is on there in one place. Hopefully easier to get to. I know I'm going to make you do 2 clicks, but yeah, I'm sorry about that. But now everything's in one place. So from a administrative standpoint, it makes things a little easier for me. So I hope you understand because we got stuff to do. It's summer.
Well, it's true. It
So,
is.
so, and again, I want to thank everybody who has subscribed, all of our watchers, our listeners, anybody who comments, and just makes the community a better place.
It
So,
does. We appreciate it. You're listening, but also you're sharing is really important.
so with that, my dear, I think it's your turn.
It's my turn. So tonight we're going to talk about the Djinn.
Ah.
We're finally taking this deep dive. Now I have to tell you, I have had some compunctions about this whole thing, and I have left this topic for quite a while for this very reason. I have a dear friend who wrote extensively about the Djinn, and from the moment she started writing about it, she was ill, and she ended up dying after her 3rd book on the subject. And she was always a little unsure what had caused it. She was just one of those health freaks. She was never overweight. She ate really good. She was always very active and was at literally the prime of her life. And so it's always been a concern. But anyhow, I decided, was kind of sent on a path that took me to this. So I decided now was the time. So for those who are not aware, the Djinn, we have very little idea what it really is. In the United States, we think of it as I dream of genie and, and that kind of stuff. But it is actually comes from the Quran, and I apologize up front if I misstate anything. I'm not an expert in the Quran. I've tried really hard to get enough information so that I don't stumble in any way. So if I am inadvertently say something, please send me a correction rather than getting upset. Just because it's a different faith and it takes years to really know some faith. And, it's the same with Judaism. It's the same with Catholicism. All of these have their own components, and I do my best to stumble through and not inadvertently say anything wrong. So up front, I'm telling you that. So the Quran and I believe it's called the Hadith or Hadiths, are 2 books from the faith of the Muslims, and in these books they talk about the Jinn. There are other texts, and I believe it's even mentioned in the Bible slightly, but first of all, what are the Jinn? So the story goes that God made 3 sets of creatures: the angels, who were made of light; the Jinn, who are made of fire without smoke; and then the humans, who are made of clay. We're going to get into what the angels are and how they have everything about them at a later date. We'll get into some more detail. Now, the Jinn, like humans, have free will. So they will have a day of judgment, according to everything I've read from different imams and things like that, which are priests of the Muslim faith. They are very intelligent, very quick-witted. They like to play word games, and they can be easy to anger. They can both be very evil, and it says very good. I have to tell you, going through the stories, I did not find any really super good Jinn stories that were the people were positively impacted by them, but they say that is so I'm going to add that. They have some properties that we don't have. They're shapeshifters. There are ones that are winged. They have seafaring ones and ones who dwell in graveyards. Those are called the Ghul, Ghul. They also have ones who take up residence in abandoned places. We're going to talk about one of those near the very end. They have the ability to be invisible. In fact, that's their natural state with us. They can do fortune telling or future telling. They have the ability to talk to us through telepathy. They can teleport. Now, they can grant wishes. They are, in those respects, very powerful, but they have limitations. One of the things I found fascinating is that when they are shape-shifting, they have to live under the biological rules of the thing they've shape-shifted into. So if you are shape-shifting into a cat or a rabbit or a woman, you can be killed. Even though they're immortal in their natural state, they can lose their immortality through being killed, and they can be killed by any object that would kill a mortal animal or a human. So a knife, a gun, hit by a car, anything, because they were in a human state. So at that moment, they give up their immortality to do that particular thing. And they don't, for that reason, stay in those shapes for very long because it's a risk. But they can do it, and they do it. They tend to like black dogs. We're all familiar with the black dogs of Europe, but they tend to pick black dogs, often cats. There's a story we're going to talk about later where it shape shifts into 3 different things within a few seconds. And they tend to like uninhabited places, so deserts, abandoned properties, places where they're away from humans. They do kind of coexist in the areas where we are because they like our food.
Why not? Yeah.
Well, hey, I mean, dude, I happen to have to tell you, there's a place here in Bedford whose wings are rocking, so I would recommend it to anybody, even a Djinn. And so, yeah. But anyway, so they like our food. They will use our food, but they don't really want to interact with us too often. When they do interact, it's often dangerous. Now, there are stories in the Quran and other Muslim texts, a small amount in non-biblical texts in the Judaic faith that also indicate, and we've touched on it once before, just briefly, that King Solomon during his lifetime had kind of gone rogue at some point, and he was supposedly had managed to gain control of the jinn and demons, is what the biblical texts call them. But if you look at the Quran and those documents, they refer to them as the jinn, and that he used them. He told them what to do, and they were at his bidding, and that is in the Muslim religious texts as well. So they are responsible for their actions. At some point, there will be a last judgment, and they will be held accountable for whatever they did. They like to lead humans astray. They like to cause them harm. They are often referred to as prankish or puckish in nature, but a lot of what they do is really not nice at all. So we've learned over our lifetimes, our generations, our millennia, to be afraid of them or leery of them, because they will trick you and they will guide you into a situation where you're going to find yourself in harm's way and then laugh at you when you struggle. And I mean literally laugh at you. So they're very difficult beings, and I'm going to share some stories. So I found these are stories, some of them are from Westerners who encountered them in the Middle East, and some of them are from folks who grew up in the Middle East in different countries, and they're very common. We tell ghost stories and demon stories in very much the same vein as many of these cultures tell their stories of the jinn. So this is where I'm going to start with. So this is a story about a gentleman who had an uncle who went to visit some family in India. When he got to the family's home, it was a beautiful home, and because it's so warm and muggy, they have a courtyard in a lot of these homes where you can go out and sleep at night so you can get the cool night air. And he was, of course, invited to come out and sleep in the courtyard with everybody else. But he was also warned against this one corner. They said, don't put your bedding in that corner because there's a jinn who sleeps there. And he doesn't like it when you annoy him. And he took up residence here long before we came here, and he's just, as long as we don't sleep in that corner, he's okay with us. He thought it was funny. He did not believe the stories, and according to his family, the first night he deliberately put his bedding in the place he was told not to. One of those.
Why?
Because some people just have to be that person, I think. So anyhow, he puts his bedding there and goes to sleep. In the middle of the night, he wakes up and his bedding has been dragged all the way across the courtyard to the entire other side. And he laughs and he thinks, okay, the family's doing it. It's a trick. It's a prank. So he goes to sleep, and the following night he does the same thing. He puts his bedding over there and he puts a note on his pillow and he says, "Stop pranking me. I know there's no such thing as the Djinn." And he pins it to his pillow. And that night he wakes up when something hits him, pushes him, and he falls off his bedding, and he hit so hard he rolled, and he rolled to almost the other side, and the note was thrown in his lap as he tried to sit up, and there was on the other side of it was scrawled the words, "I sleep here." And the family said it was really frightening for him because it wasn't dark at that point in time. It was almost daylight now, and he could see, and there was nobody awake anywhere, nobody near him when this all happened. And they co-inhabit with the people of the Middle East. They live in houses. I've came across dozens of stories where people took up a residency, rented a house or bought a property, and then came to find out that they couldn't use a certain room in the house or a certain floor of the house or whatever, because when they tried to, the Djinn would let it be known. There was another story I read where the family it was a great big house, and they had 2 rooms in this one section that they told to everybody to stay out of. And of course, when extended family came, they went poking in those rooms. They found furniture, but all the furniture was turned so that you couldn't sit on it. It was shoved up so that the seating part was against the wall, like it was looking at the wall. So they thought it was funny, and they rearranged the furniture, spent the afternoon in the room, and went on with their evening, visited with the family, went to bed, got up the next day, and the furniture was turned back the other way. So they went and they were saying to the family, "Okay, look, that was funny. Yeah, I get it. Funny prank." And they're like, "You did what?" And they're like, "Seriously, we went in and we rearranged the furniture. We did it again." And they walked upstairs with the head of the family, who was really upset and wanted to go up and apologize to the Djinn. And they walk in the room and all the furniture's turned upside down. And the interesting part for them was that every person who lived in that house was in the room downstairs whenever they told the story. There was nobody upstairs. They heard no sound. It was just done.
And did the head of household give the apology?
Yes, he did.
I would assume so. Most profusely. Yeah.
Like, "I am really sorry that they were stupid jerks. I apologize. I don't want you mad at me. Please don't do anything to us." So the next story is really interesting to me because I came across definitely different types of people who told stories of Djinn who presented themselves as human and lived among the humans for whatever the reason. So there was a story about this young lady who went to boarding school, and she was a bit of a bully and got into arguments with some of the others. There was another girl at the school who was likewise a bit of a bully and wasn't tolerating the foolishness. So she and this other girl get into a fight, and the second bully, she had a locket that she wore all the time. It was always on her. She never took it off, and everybody knew that. So when the bully started, she started calling names and what have you, and they started getting into a shoving match. And the first bully grabs this locket off the other girl's neck and rips it off, the chain off. And that's when everything stopped, because the bully girl, the first bully, she freezes in place because the other student started out screaming, "No, that's my locket," in a young woman's voice. And by the time the words were all done, she was talking in a man's voice, and her body began to move and contort and reconfigure. And eventually, the being said that she was a Djinn and she had traveled from far away. In the meantime, the girl who had broken the locket, she had physical symptoms. Her tongue swelled, she could almost not breathe, and she got very, very ill. When the whole thing started, the teachers had come running into the room because this was at the boarding school, and they saw the young woman, contort and change shapes and what have you. And they went to the parents, contacted the parents, and said that, are you aware this is a Djinn? This is a Djinn, whatever this girl is. And the parents were like, yes, we know. We've been taking care of her for years. And we had gotten a locket, which allowed her to not change shape. So she was pinned into being human as long as that locket was on her. But when the locket was torn off, her identity was revealed and she returned to being a Djinn.
Is that common? I mean, amongst the stories that you found?
There's a lot of stories about sorcery, magic, shamans, things like that, who either help or cause these Djinn to be stuck in a certain position. But if you mess with them, there's a whole bunch of other stuff, like if you wanted to become an evil magician and manage the Djinn and try to contain them and manipulate them, because you can do it. Only could King Solomon do it, but those who have the ability, the black arts to do it, could do it. But if you don't succeed at it, they take you, which is a real prohibitive thing. So, and they can possess you, which is we're going to get into. I was fascinated to learn about that, and we're going to get into that. And so I just kind of started my way with the smaller stories, and we work our way up. So there is this wonderful story about this man who went to his village. He walked in town every day to pray in the morning. On the dirt road into town, all the front doors faced the road, and he usually encountered a lot of people coming in to pray. They're very dedicated, and usually people would come out and they would say their prayers, and he would see them, and they would follow him into the chapel, whatever they call it. And this day he saw nothing, so he goes in to pray, and he's the only person there. Very odd. And while he's praying, he gets this feeling like there's somebody behind him. You know that feeling you get whenever you know someone's looking at you and you turn around and there is somebody there?
All too well, yeah.
So that's exactly what happened. But he also felt like there was a bright light behind him, but he couldn't see it. And it was just like he sensed it. So he finishes up and he leaves, and he's unnerved and a bit puzzled. And he kept that feeling for quite a while, the whole time he was praying, that there were people behind him, but he couldn't see anything. Later on in the day, he bumps into a friend of his, and he said, hey, I didn't come to the church to pray today because I saw there was a huge turnout. I walked by, and through the front door, I could see that all the rows were filled with men dressed in white. And he said, there was nobody there. And he said, yeah, these men dressed in white. Everybody must have turned out there, and strangers besides. And all we could think about was, were these the Djinn playing a prank on him and taking up the seats and keeping everybody else out for whatever the reason? Because he saw nothing.
I got to admit, whenever you're saying about these pranks, the first thing that went through my mind was, and you have a cat named for that.
Yeah.
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 Loki.
Well, I didn't pick his name. His name was pre-picked by his previous person.
Uh-huh.
And I just didn't change it. But yeah.
Yeah, but that's being a jokester. That's the first thing that went through my head. So it made me wonder. I mean, if there wasn't some basis, in reality for Norse mythology.
I have to tell you, I have had some really odd things. Like, for example, I'm gonna go off topic for like 2 minutes. Years ago, my kids wanted a dog. I wanted a golden retriever. So I reached out to the local historic or humane societies and asked. Months and months go by, don't hear from anybody. And because I was very specific, I wanted a golden retriever. I wanted it to be fixed or we could have it fixed. And I wanted one that was good with cats and children. And so nothing. And then one day I get this email from the Humane Society, and this lady sent a picture, and she said, "Please, this is the dog that you described. It's everything you want, except it's a black lab. It's not a golden retriever. They're going to kill her. Her time's almost up. She's a wonderful dog. I'm begging you to at least take a look at her." And she was like, I'm texting every person who's ever asked for a dog. She was determined, God love her. So, of course, my kids saw the picture immediately. They needed to go see this dog. She saw us. We saw her. We got her. And then I say, "What's her name?" And they go, "Puka." And I start to laugh because I didn't name her. So she was named for me, and so was this one. And I can't tell you what, but I just think it's kind of ironic. So I want to tell another story, and I want you to, as you're hearing these stories, eventually we're going to draw this up to a conclusion. So this is a story told about a couple in a town in the Middle East, and the husband worked a lot, so he was out of town quite a bit, and his wife was kind of lonely. And in this area, the houses, most of the houses have like a little walled area between houses so that there's privacy. And people will sit on the wall and talk to each other or stuff like that, but they might maintain a social distance, if you will. And this lady began talking to these neighbors who moved in very recently, and particularly she was talking to the gentleman. She never saw the woman, but he would come and sit on the wall, and he would talk to her, and she would talk to him, and he would always like sit on the wall with his back to her and like look out at his own house and his yard. And then if she asked him a question, he'd turn a little bit and she'd get a bit of a profile, and he would answer her question, and then they'd move on. Well, she did ask him some questions, "Are you married?" And he said yes. And she finally said one day, "Why don't you bring your wife and come over for tea? And that way I can get to know her too." And as soon as she said that, he literally elongated and his legs stretched out really long, like 10 feet. And he was down off her wall and in her side of the yard. And he said to her as she's standing there staring, because like they were long, he dropped down and then he's normal looking again. "Why did you not tell me that you would invite me for tea before? I'd love to come have tea with you." And she said, "Where is your wife?" And he said, "I don't have a wife, but I needed an invitation."
Oh boy, yeah, chills right there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Like as
yeah.
I was going through this, I started like comparing it, and I'm clicking down through all the different things, and I'm like, dude, there are some amazing similarities. Here's another one. So there's a very old story, Persian story, about a woman who goes to the public bathhouse. So bathhouses are really popular, and were for quite a long time. And women would go to their bathhouse and men would go to their bathhouse. And because of modesty, they would not swim together and what have you, okay? But it's hot, and and it's a nice relief, and so it was something people would do. And supposedly the Djinn like bathhouses. I don't know why, but that's one of the things that they make a point of in multiple stories. So anyhow, this lady goes to the public bathhouse, and she's in there. She gets dressed, and as she's inside, she notices that there's another person in the next little cubicle getting dressed, and she looks down, and instead of seeing feet, she sees hooves, cloven hooves. The woman freaks out. She runs out. She finds an attendant, and she says, "There's this person with hooves instead of feet in the bathhouse. You've got to go. You've got to go." And the attendant looks at her and smiles and lifts up her skirt, and she says, "Oh, do you mean like these?" And she had cloven feet as well.
Uh,
So, there's a lot of these kinds of stories. There's a story about this one, and this I found interesting. So they can sometimes be bullies as well. For example, there's a story about a young woman who had been talking to a man. She thought it was a man, and she woke up the next morning and she had a triangle of henna, it's a dark dye, in her hand, painted in her hand. And she asked her family, what does this mean? And everyone said that it was the sign that she had married a Djinn. And she said, no, I didn't. I didn't do any such thing. And she's like, I only ever talked to that one guy. And then she sort of realized that, she didn't really know much about this guy. She just talked to him a little bit, hadn't done anything untoward, but he had marked her as his. And the person who wrote the story said, the tragic truth is she was never lucky in love. Everybody who ever showed any interest in her came to a mysterious fate.
Wow. Talk about your jealous boyfriend.
Yeah. So there's another story about a young woman, and she was a very lovely young lady. Her family would talk about how kind and sweet and gentle she was, and suddenly something happened to her. And she began to act very cold, very different, very aggressive. She was bullying family members and people, and it just was not like her. And after this went on for a little while, her brother decided to take the bull by the horns, and he confronted her, and he said, what is going on? And she ignored him and turned her back to him, and he tapped her on the shoulder, and he said again, what is going on? And she looked at him, took her hand, and she threw him across the room, and he hit the wall and slid down. He stood up and he said to whatever was there, it is not right that you have taken control of my sister. You cannot do this. And so he began to read the Quran, and he kept telling it, you need to leave her body. You need to leave her body. But the Djinn did not want to leave. And he turned, and in his own voice, using his sister's body, it said, I like this body. I'm not leaving. Well, you can imagine that they went for some religious help at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And these stories get a little darker as we move through them, because it gets darker the further you go into the concept of the Djinn. So this next story is told by a young man. He is a American, and he was living in the Middle East with a nomadic tribe. Now, why he was there, he doesn't make clear, but he was. He had been living with them for some time and traveling with them. And he had been asking questions as he went along. And most of the time, the people in this little tribe were very accommodating. They'd answer his questions, explain why they did things a certain way, that kind of stuff, like anybody would if you were living with a group of people from a different nationality and you just didn't know all the rules. So he got to hearing them talk about the Djinn, and he asked, what are the Djinn? Who are the Djinn? How do you know if there's a Djinn? And nobody would answer him. They just didn't want to talk about it. And it was a very almost superstitious fear, if you will. And in a large part, it's because there's a belief that if you talk or you deal with them, it draws you in, or draws them into you. So anyhow, this guy finds out that they're moving, the tribe is moving, because they're nomads, so they move from time to time, to different areas. And he is told that he's supposed to follow this particular person, that they're going to move in like segments. So they're going to go, so many guys are going to go and set up the tents and get things ready, and then others will follow after. And so he's told he's got to follow this one older gentleman. And I've learned a little bit about what their deserts are like versus our deserts. So in the United States, our deserts have like sagebrush and little trees, chaparral, stuff like that, and landmarks and fixtures. In the Middle East, it's just sand. Like there's nothing but sand for hundreds of miles in places. So he was told by the older gentleman who was leading the way that he was supposed to follow closely behind him and do not get lost, because there's no landmark. So if you get lost, there's no way to find you or for you to find your way back. The other thing is that when you're traveling with camels, you don't ride them the whole time, because it's exhausting. So you ride for a while, then you walk your camel for a while to give it a break. And because, you don't want to wear it out and have it exhausted to the point where it dies. So he was told, as they got to this area that was filled with nothing but sand dunes, we're going to walk along, they called them the skirt of the dunes, the end of the dunes, the bottom of the dunes. In this area, don't veer off anywhere, don't climb up on the dunes, don't do anything. And he's like, okay, okay. And he starts walking behind the guy, and all of a sudden, he says, it's as though his brain turned off. He grabs the camel, as leading, and he starts up the dune. Well, the other guy's just plodding along, figuring, that he's right behind him, because you can't really make a lot of sand in the sand, or sound in the sand. Try that a couple times. And he goes up the top of this dune, and he's dragging the camel with him, and then down the other side, and he's like not thinking at all. And finally, when he gets to the bottom, he walks around a little while, and he's completely lost. And suddenly it dawns on him that he has no clue where he's at. And he very well could die out there. So he starts climbing up on the sand dune, hoping he'll see something. And way out in the distance, he eventually sees this motion that turns out to be the old man and his camel. And he starts screaming as he's coming down the other side, headed in that direction. And the old guy stops to wait for him. And he says to him, and the guy's like, I don't know why I did this. I don't know what's going on. And the old man says, why did you do it? Where did you go? And he said, I told you this is a very dangerous place, and you were to listen to me. And the young man said, he said, I don't know, I can't answer you. All of a sudden, I just couldn't think, and I just felt compelled to go over that dune and keep going in the other direction. And the man looked at him seriously, and he said, you know how you've been asking about the Djinn? Well, they live in places like this, desolate, and you cannot see them. But they can take the form of animals or humans, and they can talk in your head. Whenever a voice tells you that you are better than others, or fills you with vanity or superiority or self-importance, that is a Djinn speaking. The Djinn works to separate you from other people, never to connect you to them. The Djinn will kill you easily, and almost killed you today. And he said he just walked away, and he realized that maybe he wasn't as interested in the Djinn as he thought he was. And he said, he actually thought about it. He's like, that's actually what was going through my head. Why do I have to listen to him? I'm perfectly capable of doing this myself. It was that vanity that led him out there. And he said he was going to argue about it with the old man until he realized, no, that is exactly what I thought. So I'm going to tell you, this is probably, for me personally, was one of the most uncomfortable stories, because it's really plain at the end what happens. This is about a young man, is an American, who was fascinated with the Middle East, and he took his vacations and what have you over in the Middle East, and he just did the tourist stuff, just the normal tourist stuff. You get on a minibus and you go to this shrine and that mosque and this whatever, right? And you hear the tour guide tell you the spiel. That's what he was doing this day. So he's on his little minibus with a couple people he knows. Most of everybody else are strangers to him. They have a tour guide who's kind of rushing them from point A to point B. I've done tour guiding. That's normal routine. You got to keep them moving, stay on that schedule, because you're got to be certain places. So he's fascinated. He's gets back to the bus. He's on the bus. He's riding along, and he's watching the farmland go by. He doesn't really feel like talking. He's thinking about the history of the place he had just left. And then inexplicably, he starts to think about something else. He starts thinking about, he had been contracted to put on a program for an event a few months earlier, and had signed a contract for a fairly decent sum of money to be paid to him for putting on said event. And it was at a big conference, and there were a lot of vendors, and anybody that has ever worked that stuff, that usually you get paid that day. And the woman who had set up the event didn't pay him or anybody else that day. She made the excuse that she forgot her checkbook, and she'd catch them tomorrow. And you know how that goes. When you see that happen, it's usually a bad sign. And it was a bad sign. So he starts thinking about the fact that she gypped him. He found out after a few weeks of talking to her and all the lies she had told that nobody else got paid either. And he realized that nobody was getting paid. She took the money and ran. So he's a little frustrated about it, and he's not really sure why it popped in his head, but it did. And that's important. So as he's going along thinking about this stuff, they kind of have left the farmland, and they're now out in the desert, passing through this area of really empty desert, headed to the next town. And it's at that point that he says he feels something squeeze his mind. He says, take your hand and just squeeze it with your other hand. And that's exactly what I felt, but in my head. And he paused and he was waiting. And all of a sudden, here's this voice in his head. And he thinks it's a man. And he says, it says, you know, I want you to know that when you came through my territory, I projected to see what you and all of the others were thinking. And none of them could see me or hear me, but you could hear me. And I am fascinated. I like the shape of your brain, which is something like, it's
That's quite
okay.
a compliment. Yeah.
It is, you know, and he's listening to this thing and he's trying to make this whole thing make sense in his head. And he said, you know, he had been introduced to the concept of the Djinn, and he was in shamanism and all this. So he wasn't completely without a reference point. And at that point, he said, you know, I don't know what to say. Are you a Djinn? And she said, I should inform you. When I saw your conveyance traveling through my area, my territory, I will extend myself and was receptive to your thoughts. But I perceived that you have talked to the Djinn before, and he remembered something that happened in another visit to another country when he had been a tourist, and that he had suspected for a long time had been that. And she says to him, since you have had a relationship with the Djinn before, you know us, and we you. This means that the correct protocol has been established, allowing me to engage you on a different level. And she begins to talk to him, and he asks her some questions. She says, I'm immortal and have been in relationships with more humans than you can count for thousands of your years. You are also immortal, but your kind has nearly forgotten that.
Wow. That's kind of profound.
Yes, I thought so too. Because, you know, because you have a soul, you are immortal, but we have kind of forgotten that. And then she starts to laugh, and at that comment that the humans have nearly forgotten it. And he said he, at that point, felt an energy run through him that he could only explain as schizophrenic, like all these different emotions going all these different ways all at the same time. And he stops, and he had his eyes closed when this whole thing started, and he opened one eye, and he realized every person on the minibus was sound asleep except for the tour guide, who was staring straight ahead and had been, throughout the tour up until this point, had been chattering away during those driving time to kind of burn the time up while the driver drove. And the driver, who just kept blindly staring straight ahead and not just staying on the road. And the tour guide just staring blankly and not saying a word. And hears this voice change, and instead of a man, it becomes very feminine. And he's in his mind's eye, he sees a column of white light with a blue-green aura on the roof of the minibus, and he's trying to make sense out of all these things he's feeling and seeing. And he said everybody just remained asleep. And he said at that moment I understood that this was not a male genie, this was a female Genia is what he calls her, Genia. And he narrowed his focus, and he said suddenly she started to laugh, and she started to tease me, and it was almost erotic. And he said my body responded before I could stop it. And she laughed and she said, don't don't ignore that beautiful feeling. And she starts laughing at him hard, like she had the controls and she was pleased with this, right? And he was a little embarrassed and ashamed and he wanted it to stop. And then it was quiet for a moment. And then she said, I can see there is someone who wronged you, a woman, and she is linked to you. And she described her as having short hair. And he said, in the moment she said all this, I saw that woman who had cheated me, but only for a brief second. And in this voice said, oh, that is her, isn't it? As soon as he saw her in his mind's eye for a second, and he realized that whatever this thing was, it had heard him thinking about this earlier and had picked up the dark thoughts. It went away at that point for a little while. And he's still sitting there. Nobody's making a sound. Everything's just kind of going in status. And he's thinking, they've literally charmed these people, put a spell on them or something. Nobody's moving. It was as though they were all in a coma. They couldn't move. And after a few minutes, he hears her voice back in his head and he feels it enter the back of his neck. And he says, the being says, I found her and her husband too, in the city by the lake, which is exactly true. The city she lived in was by a lake. And he said, I suddenly felt a sense of malice and I became fearful. And the woman, the genie, the genia says, I cast a spell upon her and her husband and her blood and those who marry into her family for 100 years. And I wanted to cross this lifetime and into the next. And she starts laughing mockingly. And he said his heart sank. His belief system did not allow for vengeance. And he said, I didn't ask you to do this. And I don't practice harm ever. And she said, oh, you didn't harm anybody. You didn't ask me to do it. I just did it for you. And it begins to concern him. And he says, well, I don't want you to do it. I don't want you to hurt anyone. And what if she pays the money to me? What if something changes? How does that stop you? For 100 years, her family has to suffer for some stupid, foolish act? And she says, well, perhaps I will tell you how to lift the curse. But then again, perhaps not. And, now he's feeling really upset. And he said, she said, I am not like I'm not like humans who break their oaths. You need lessons learned. And this is going to be considerable. And he said, I could see almost dark storm clouds wrapped around her. And this is really important. We've talked about demonic entities and like that black mist that goes around him. He described it very similarly, hiding the light and just gurgling all around her. And it scared him. And he didn't know what to do about it. And then she said that she has to leave soon. She said, in the old days, those with power and knowledge like you, who can see and can hear, could bind us to your will. In those times, you would have been called a binder of demons. And she laughs. You could have had many jinn in your service. And then there was a long pause, and she said, I invite you to visit me whenever you pass through my domain again, or any time that you choose to. And now that you have established a soul pattern with me, you will be able to find me again. And until the next time, live well, binder. And she goes away. And he said he felt it pop out the back of his neck, literally.
If they're going to be judged on their actions, I don't think that would be a favorable action.
No, I don't either. It's a very creepy thing. And she flat out says, a binder of demons. You would have been a binder of demons. And she references it back to herself. You could bind us to your will. In those times, you would have been a binder of demons. Us, the demons. I thought it was fascinating, and I could see where we were headed. And then I came across a most interesting thing. So, on a spiritual realm, the imams and the spiritual leaders do exorcisms very much in their own way, but they read the Quran. They extol this thing that it has to leave in the name of Allah. It's very similar to an exorcism of demons. And then I came across this interesting paper that was written about the psychology of Djinn possession. That although it's not a subject, nor is demonic possession, frankly, a subject that usually psychology considers, this particular psychologist from the Middle East wrote this paper, and he said in it, true possession consists of an occult experience, an invitation, and unknown influences. Very little has appeared in writing about Djinn possession, almost nothing in medical publications. We either describe it as a cultural or a religious or a psychiatric problem and offer guidance and management through a clinical practice. But he talks about how the prophet Solomon contrived to subjugate the jinn and get them to perform tasks. And in the Islamic text, true jinn possession can cause a person to have seizures and speak in incomprehensible tongues. The possessed is unable to think or to speak of their own free will, and these cases are outnumbered by those of the physical and psychological nature. And he said, faith healers take the money for the treatment of the latter. Church attempts to distinguish between real possession and pseudo-possession, and in all cases of real possession, the task of a therapist who must have a strong faith in Allah is to expel the jinn. In other words, he's saying that therapists should commit to exorcisms. And then he goes on to talk about how do you tell the difference between. And it's fascinating because there's a criteria in the Christian tradition of the things that a person's going to look for to decide if it's a mental health issue or it's really a demonic issue. Those same things, they different words maybe, but meaning exactly the same thing, are listed as the criteria. And he gives a case of a 25-year-old woman from Iraq who had no psychiatric history. And he talks about she suddenly withdrew from people. She became uncommunicative. She stopped eating. She stopped drinking. Her family was, scared to death for her. They took her to the doctors. Nobody could find an organic physical reason. She had a severe depression. She underwent electroshock therapy. There was no improvement. Her family didn't believe it was mental health. They believed that she was possessed by a jinn. So they went to have her exorcised, and he talks about after the sessions, her condition improved. She resumed eating and drinking, and on recovery, she explained that she had no memories for approximately 5 years. She had no feelings. She was just on autopilot, and something else was in control of her body. She is now well, has been well for several years, and remains well without medication. So now we're going to come down to a couple last stories, and these are more interesting in a lot of ways to me because they're a couple from the military. So our first real introduction to the Middle East was unfortunately military. Like there's some businessmen who traveled and what have you, but there was never any huge cross-cultural issue until the military. And again, it's unfortunate that it had to be that way. So in 2003, there was a soldier who was stationed in Iraq, and he had been helping to suppress riots, and he had been breaking up these riots from time to time, and people were not happy. So the police had been deployed to certain police stations, and they had military coming with them, and they would sit up on a high area above the first floor so you could look down on the streets, and they would shine this huge light into the cars and see who was in the cars because there were curfews, and unless you fit a certain criteria, you better not be on the street, and then the police would pull you over, you would get arrested, yada yada yada. So he's up in one of these nests on the balcony of a second floor of a police station, and he's doing security duty basically at night, and he's the guy shining the light. And it was about 2:30 in the morning. There's a car comes out of nowhere, comes down the road. He shines the light in. Now everybody, whenever you shine the light into the car, the driver winces because it's a bright light and it hurts your eyes. Usually the passenger turns his head away to get away from that bright light. This is not what happens this time. So he said that the driver did exactly what he expected. He winced and tried to squint his eyes and keep his eyes on the highway because, you know, you don't want to have an accident. So he said the passenger had a much different reaction. His eyes glowed with an intensity by the light. He stared right into the light, almost looking through the light at us. It was eerie. We had the sense that he could see us, not just the light, but he could see us. And his eyes shone like a cat in the dark, and it reflected back. He said, I've never seen a person whose eyes reflect like that. Now, I will say there is a very rare genetic disease where some people can do that, but it's extremely rare. And he was just really shaken. He's like, when I said anything, the local police were like, no, 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 that was a Djinn. Don't mess with that. Let that one go through. And he said, I would have thought they were crazy and superstitious, except there was something so uncanny and unnerving about those eyes looking up at us, and I know they saw us. So he didn't argue. And there were so many other stories. There was a story about two young soldiers, a male and a female, who had fallen in love, military wartime romance. And there was this particular building on the military base that wasn't used at night, and it had a couple really good features. First of all, the door locked from the inside as well as the outside. Second of all, there was a huge generator right outside the building. So if somebody opened the door, it would automatically make the sound really loud, and the generator sounds would come through, and you would know somebody was there. So for the young lovers, this was awesome. And for the first few nights that they stayed in that area, they made up a pallet of bed, kind of a bed. They were okay, but then the girl began to hear walking, and she would wake up, and she would wake him up, and she said, somebody in here with us. And he's like, you're crazy, you're just feeling guilty, stop it. And she's like, no, there's somebody in here, I hear them walking. And then the whispering started. They would be in this little room in the complete dark, and they would hear two voices whispering. They could never tell what the words were, but it was whispering. And then the footsteps would come up to their bed. The first time this happened, he honestly thought it was that he had been discovered. And so he picked up the flashlight from the floor and shone it around, fully expecting to see an officer who was going to really bust their butts. And there was nobody there, and the footsteps turned around and walked away. And this went on until one night they had this routine. They had gone in that night and said, this was our last night together for a while, so don't screw with us tonight, whoever or whatever you are, just don't screw with us, please. We just want to have this one last night. And sure enough, a little while later, the girl wakes him up and she says, do you hear the talking? And he's like, yep, I can hear it. Couldn't make out the words, but he could definitely hear two people talking. It walks up to the bed. He turns on the flashlight, and there's nothing there. There's no footprints, there's nothing. And suddenly, he said it sounded like a huge metal plate crashing on the floor beside the bed. And it just reverberated through this building so loud. And he said, I don't know why, but it just filled us both with such panic that we just jumped up and took off running. And whenever we got to the door, he said, I want you to know, I had not only locked the door, but I had rigged up a kind of a jury-rigged lock of a second lock, and everything was still in place. Whatever or whoever was there was not human. And then subsequently, he would hear the Djinn stories and start to wonder if they had not stepped into the space of a Djinn. So the next story is about a psychic warrior. So there is a guy by the name of David Morehouse who wrote some books. He worked for the military. He was a remote viewer. And one of the things he was told to remote view was in Jordan. There's a valley called Batin el Ghul, and it's literally translates to the belly of the beast. And the military required him to see what was there through remote viewing. So he sits down to do it. He knew a little bit about it. He had heard about it from people. It had a really bad reputation for being haunted. And he was supposed to see if there were Jordanian soldiers in the area, if they were setting up for fighting. We don't realize how much they tried to remote view for about 30 years, but they did use it sometimes successfully, sometimes not. So anyway, he's remote viewing, and this is what he says. Jordanian soldiers had often talked of demons stalking through the wasteland and attacking people. The whole valley was said to be cursed. But he said he went ahead and started a remote view. Suddenly, he sustained a head injury when he was accidentally shot in the helmet while he was sitting there. Doesn't make any sense. And he claimed that the helmet hitting him, the shot, this is when he started the remote viewing, made him psychic, and that's when his whole thing started. So he's remote viewing this place, and he said, I saw dark figures moving effortlessly across the floor of the valley, the apparitions. They poured from the rocks in various heaps and shapes and moved in clusters through the tents of the Jordanians who were already there. I heard muffled cries from the Jordanian encampment, and momentarily I thought they were overrun by thieves or the Israelis. Panicked, I turned to run for help, colliding with the figures, and reflexively I closed my eyes, except I didn't collide. I wasn't in my body, and I walked right through them, and they through me. I turned and I watched this figure disappear over the edge of the bluff, and there was no one there.
So I wonder then what actually happened to the soldiers.
I don't know. But it was fascinating, and I want to tell one story. So we talked a lot about the Middle East. I want to tell you that there are stories that have happened here in the United States, and there are a lot more. People from that went to the Middle East have brought stuff back. About 2-3 years ago, I was actually contacted by a woman whose sister had been stationed in the Middle East. Well, this woman had been stationed in the Middle East with her husband, and her sister had come to stay with them, had bought some pottery, and she had bought a vase, and she had brought it home, and she had left it unpacked or packed up and in a box for like 20 years. So she's, I mean, like people hoard, it's always
All
that
too
thing,
well, yeah.
That, I'll do that later. One of these days I'll find the perfect place for it. I'll just leave it sitting where it's safe till then. But anyhow, she moves into a different house. She finally decides that she either has to get rid of stuff or she has to unpack it. So she decides to keep the vase, and she unpacks it. And that's whenever craziness starts. So the sister, the woman, she's now in her 60s, starts hearing footsteps in her bedroom. Her closet door opens and closes. The house was not previously haunted. She had been living in it for almost 9 months. There had been no activity in this house. And she would hear footsteps upstairs in her bedroom when there was nobody there. It was making her physically ill and mentally ill. Like, this is what caused this woman's sister to get a hold of me. She's like, there is something seriously wrong. I lived for 6 years in the Middle East. I think that there was a jinn attached to that vase, and when she took it out of storage, she brought it into her home. She invited it in, and it's making her ill. I'm afraid it's going to kill her. And they tried the ghost hunter route and all this other stuff, and nothing helped. And so we worked on it, and eventually we did get some help. We got this taken care of, but it was literally, I had to do a crash course on the Djinn to do it, because I had to figure out how they would respond. Because interestingly enough, some demons and things will only recognize the rituals from the nationality that they associate with. So like Buddhists have a special way of doing an exorcism, and some demons won't recognize a Christian exorcism. They will only recognize a Buddhist exorcism.
I find that extraordinarily curious.
It is, but it's true.
It's not the belief system, but actually the particular religion or belief system, but it actually the process and the wow.
John Zaffis and I talked about it. He told me about a particular place where the person was possessed, and they used the Catholic rite of exorcism and did it just as they had done it many, many, many times before, and nothing happened. And eventually it came out that this had been picked up while the person was in a Buddhist country, and the entity refused to recognize the Christian rite of exorcism. So they contacted a Buddhist priest who came in. He did an exorcism, and it responded to that and left.
Still, I'm trying to wrap my head around that one. That is It almost makes me think it's not the power of God that made it happen, but the power of that particular belief system
I don't
that
know.
makes it happen.
But it is that way. They will sometimes
Oh,
only respond for certain belief systems, but other ones will respond and call by name from any. But there are different types of systems. I mean, even in the Bible, there's the story about the disciples who were trying to cast out this demon the way they had seen Christ do it, and it didn't work. And so they went back and they were like, dude, what do we do wrong? And he's like, oh, it's a different type. This one only comes out through fasting and prayer. So there are different mechanisms for different demons.
but based on geography, that's
Geography,
uh,
lots of different
I'm
things.
not trying to poo-poo it. I'm
No,
just trying
no,
to
it's
get
just,
my
it's
head around
interesting.
it.
It's
That's
interesting. So I want to end with this story. So I had talked about my friend who had died after writing the 3 books on the Djinn. This woman was internationally known, 30 some years, had written over about 100 books. I would say, I'm not 100% sure, but it was a huge amount of books, all of it on this stuff. And anything in the paranormal. She had ghost hunted. She had done Bigfoot hunts, UFOs, everything under the sun you could imagine. And so she decided to dig into this stuff about the Djinn. She had actually gone on investigations where a Djinn was haunting a spot and refusing to allow people to stay there. Upstate New York, an old abandoned house, a couple buys it and they want to tear it down and build a new house. Doesn't seem like such a big deal, does it? It's abandoned, it's on a property, they bought the property, nobody's been in this place for years. Except every time anything happens when they start working on trying to tear it down, the equipment malfunctions, it moves from one spot to another. They put cameras in thinking people are playing dirty tricks on them, and they catch this being of fire, a pillar of fire going through the building, not catching the building on fire, but going through the building and shape-shifting into almost like a huge gnome-like entity with glowing eyes. And they don't know what it is. So over the course of time, through various means, this particular person goes in with a team and begins to work the case very much like you would a ghost hunt, and ends up contacting this thing that tells her it's a Djinn and that it owns this place, has been there for millennia, and doesn't want this structure torn down. It's fond of it. It makes me rethink elementals.
It makes me think of your story about the 5-year Walmart that never was and the biggest
Yeah.
landslide in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
That sounds eerily similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating, isn't it? So maybe if you look at different faiths, different religions, you can see that there's ghosts, there's UFOs, there's all this stuff in ours. I've been doing a really deep dive on demons and the Djinn for months now. And little bits of it's been dribbling out in the podcast, but I don't know how much people can stand before they start screaming, whoa. But from what I have learned, there are demons, entities that ran the world before for a while, that they became the gods, if you will. And that when Christianity came into play, it drove a lot of this other stuff back. And Christianity, like all other things, have morphed a little bit over time. Because, if you looked at what Christianity was 150, 200 years ago, it's not the same thing today. It's a completely different animal. Not that the Bible's different, but the way people interpret it, what they're willing to sacrifice to be a Christian, that stuff has changed. It's the same with just about every faith out there. There's moderates and what have you. I'm beginning to wonder if it's a lot simpler than we think. I found stories of demons. There's a demon out there that is named in both the Quran and in Judaic text, that in the Judaic text it's a male, in the Quran it's a female, but both of these beings are the same thing. They have 2 daughters, each of them, and the daughters scream more and more. They're dying of starvation and they drink human blood. Vampires. demons that are hairy and very tall that can come and go at will, werewolves, dogmen, Bigfoot. And I can go on, and I'm finding a correlation between what we have all these different names for and different demons out of ancient times. So maybe there are only angels and humans and jinn, and they come in different varieties, and we like to split hairs and call them different things. And if y'all were interested in that, I would love to take a deep dive with you on what really are fairies and all these other things, because believe it or not, they're in every culture and they lead back to the same places. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I would think if we reduce the items that we're investigating, or the things we're investigating and observing, that's going to make this a really short podcast. And we're not going to live that long.
Well, I mean, like, I'm just saying that, like for example, there at one point, the idea that UFOs and aliens were actually demons was like really fringe. I have to tell you, I've got 30 podcasts that are backed up on my system that have been sent to me by people, different places, some religious, some not religious, all saying that they can document and take their argument and make an argument, a fair argument, that actually these are biblical beings from ancient times traveling forward who are demonic in nature and are trying to distract humans. Because, you know, a demon doesn't have to cause you, they don't have to cause you to sin. Just the fact that you have looked away from God and you're distracted with other things and you're not putting any focus on God in and of itself causes you spiritual pain.
Something to ponder, at least.
Yeah. It is. It's interesting, isn't it? So with that, I am done, but I found this entirely fascinating, and I barely scratched the surface on the Djinn.
All right. Once again, viewers and listeners, if you've enjoyed this, please click that thumbs up, the like, give us a good rating on whatever audio platform you're listening to. That will encourage us to, what am I saying, us? That will encourage Patty to come up with more stories. She does all the research. I just do the tech stuff. And I sometimes come up with questions, some good, some bad, but you don't get to see many of the bad ones because I cut those out. I'm my own worst critic.
He's also, he's, as an editor, he can take care of all that. But I hope everybody enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. If I'm going down the rabbit holes you're not interested in, tell me so. And, there's a lot of different rabbit holes to hop down, but I just don't want to tell you the same stuff everybody's already told you. I could tell you Bigfoot stories all for the rest of our lives, or UFO stories, but what if? That's where my brain always goes, what if it's not what they tell you it is? What if it's this or that instead? With that, I will wish you a good evening.